Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Mary Mancini, and this is Nashville. The Tennessee State Legislature recently wrapped up the first half of the 114th General Assembly, and there is a lot to digest. Today, we're joined by reporters assigned to cover the state capitol for the first of a two-part review. They're here to recap bills passed, bills still waiting to be signed by the governor, and the constitutional amendments that will appear on the ballot in 2026. Joining us in the studio are Marianna Bacallao, Power and Equity reporter for WPLN, and Sarah Grace Taylor, the reporter covering state government for the Nashville Banner. Welcome to This is Nashville for your first time, Sarah Grace.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
And Marianna, welcome back.
Thank you.
Before we get started, just a quick disclosure. In a previous career, I worked as a political organizer and an operative. So, Marianna, before we get to the latest from the state legislative session, let's talk about something that happened over the weekend here in Nashville. The Tennessee Highway Patrol said they made about 150 traffic stops in what has been described as a quote-unquote active ICE operation. It's unclear at this time, although I think you have an update, how many people were detained. It's been a few days. What can you tell us about what happened?
Well, the Tennessee Highway Patrol is now saying 84 people. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is now saying that 84 people were arrested as part of that operation since May 3rd. Like you said, Tennessee Highway Patrol is saying 150 arrests. That was largely in South Nashville, which is where, Nashville's immigrant corridor is. And we're still seeing, details emerge about where those people are being held and what's next for their families.
Is there still a question about who exactly carried out the stops and the arrests?
I think now we have a pretty clear sense that it was the Tennessee Highway Patrol working in coordination with ICE agents. There were some concerns from activists at the time that Metro Nashville Police had some sort of involvement. The mayor has now come forward and clarified that their officers were stationed at the ICE facility on Sunday for an unrelated issue and then for crowd control and protest safety when a protest emerged from family members and activists, protesting these ICE raids. The mayor seems to have come out against this. Of course, it is a federal issue, so we're not sure, how much power the mayor has to stop these incidents, but he has decried them.
And he had a press conference. Is that pretty much what he said, or did he add some other details to that?
Yeah, he talked a little bit about right now now we know 84 people. We don't know their names. We don't know, what their status is. And so that is something that the mayor and Metro Legal are working to shed a little bit more light on that. They've asked ICE for those details. The state legislature earlier this year, as part of their omnibus immigration bill, made it a felony for local officials to vote in favor of sanctuary policies. Sanctuary policies were already banned by state law. So there's not much that the mayor can do on that end.
Have any other elected officials weighed in, or the governor?
The governor did respond to one of our requests for comment. He said some of the same things he said when sponsoring that immigration legislation earlier this year, that, President Donald Trump ran on a platform of increased immigration enforcement, and that, by being elected, the American people have voted for this mandate, especially here in Tennessee, with the majority of Tennesseans supporting Donald Trump. So he has come out in favor.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's turn our attention to the state. As I said earlier, the Tennessee State Legislature wrapped up the first half of the 114th General Assembly. And we say first half because each state legislative term is 2 years, meaning that when they gavel into session next January, they will be in the second half of the 114th. Let's dig into what happened during the session. Let's keep with immigration for now. And Marianna, one of the most reported on pieces of legislation is actually one that didn't pass. but it may still have legs. It's a bill that would have denied a public school education for students without legal status, or a school district could choose to charge tuition if they so wanted to. What was the journey of this bill?
Yeah, so I think at first there were 3 bills that would have accomplished the same things. I believe Gino Bolso of Franklin had one. Those bills died while this bill continued, I think largely because it was being sponsored by, House Majority Leader William Lamberth and Senator Bo Watson in the Senate, who have a little bit more, leadership and maybe influence within the state house. They also put a lot of, they wanted it to be permissive. So on, at least in the House version of it, it was, Lamberth always stressed that school districts had the option, but they didn't have to check for legal immigration status or, deny students or else charge their families tuition based on the TISA funding model. The Senate version, which is the version that passed, did require that. We did see it stall in the House because the fiscal review outlined that Tennessee could be at risk of losing $1.5 billion in federal funding because the law would put us in violation of the Civil Rights Act. So that's something where, this bill had gone through a lot of narrow votes in a lot of committees, but seemed to be, running full steam ahead towards full passage. It passed the Senate. And with a few days left in session, Lamberth ended up pulling the bill because of those outstanding questions of federal funding. And he said that he is in conversation with the federal government to ensure that that money will still come to Tennessee should the bill pass next year.
So, Sarah Grace, you used to work in Chattanooga, and
I did.
The Senate sponsor, Republican Bo Watson of Hickson, which is near Chattanooga, he faced a bit of backlash from the community for bringing up this legislation, for sponsoring it. The Hamilton County School Board unanimously passed a resolution opposing the legislation, and an organized group of faith leaders, including a pastor from Watson's own church, signed onto a letter against it. How unusual is it for Senator Watson to get this kind of pushback?
I don't know if it's unusual, and it's not the first time that Watson has even differed with Chattanooga Senator Todd Gardenhire on immigration and specifically how immigration bills will affect children and education. I do think the reaction this time was proportionate to how strong of a bill this was, to deny someone public education and to do it in a bill that would almost certainly require challenging a Supreme Court case and going through that whole legal process is pretty extreme. And I think proportionally, the reaction was pretty extreme toward Senator Watson.
And Marianna, was this the only criticism it received?
I think that there were a number of people who spoke out against the bill on, religious grounds, a lot of scripture, a lot of Bible verses. And this is something intriguing to me that I asked Lamberth and Senator Brent Taylor about. And their response is largely that this is not a religious issue. This is a secular issue. Another complaint that people had about this bill is that by deterring immigrants without legal status in Tennessee, we would be losing out on a lot of tax money that those individuals pay into our state because they're still paying sales tax. So from a business perspective, there were a lot of groups that were against it.
Is it going to come back?
Lamberth seems certain that it will. I think that because it passed the Senate, we've already seen, it had a lot of narrow votes, but the fact that it passed the Senate, I think, is maybe an indication that the House is at least willing to hear it. This is also, to zoom out a little bit, there were a lot of other state legislatures that had bills like this that did not advance, or in the case of Oklahoma, their state superintendent was really gung-ho about a similar bill, and the governor there vowed to block it. So there was some, and both of them are Republicans, and we've seen Republican opposition to this bill. But Tennessee has gotten the farthest. And so I guess what we're looking at next year is if they will get far enough to challenge Plyler v. Doe, that Supreme Court case that established the right to an education for all students.
Sarah Grace, that wasn't the only immigration proposal this year. They also considered a measure to allow the use of English only for state road tests and other motor vehicle services. And then there was one ID bill that actually did pass both houses, is now waiting for the governor's signature. What does it do?
So the bill that did pass says that, I should back up. In Tennessee, if you are an undocumented immigrant, you can't get a temporary driver's license already. But there are 14 states that do allow you to get a temporary driver's license if you're in that category. This bill says that Tennessee won't recognize those as valid driver's licenses. The subtext of that being, I think most people, but particularly the immigrant population, most commonly come in contact with law enforcement on the road. So now there's another way that you could get arrested for driving without a license, even if you did have one from another state, if you're an undocumented immigrant.
Another update this morning, the Tennessean is reporting that the Sumner County Sheriff's Department is the latest law enforcement agency in Tennessee to agree to partner with ICE. Also earlier this year, as you mentioned, Marianna, Tennessee lawmakers passed a sweeping immigration bill that would align with President Trump's agenda. Let's move on to something that surprised, I think, a lot of people this past week is that the governor issued his first veto. He, of course, has a legislative agenda that he puts forth, but he also has the final say when it comes to signing bills. And this was the first one in 6 years that he has actually vetoed. Again, just a little background. The governor, when a bill comes to his desk, he has three choices. He can either sign it, he can allow it to become law without his signature, or he can veto it. In Tennessee, it only takes a simple majority in both the House and the Senate to override the governor's veto. In other states, it takes a 2/3 majority, which gives that veto so much more power. Sarah Grace, tell us about the bill that the governor vetoed this week.
So it's the first time he's vetoed, like you mentioned, and it's a bill that would have allowed the state probation and parole board to have a broader authority to deny people probation and parole based on the crime that they were accused of or convicted of. I think while it's the first time he's done a veto, it's not really surprising that this would be an area where Lee would veto. He's very openly supported bills in the past that made it easier for people to have access to probation and parole when they left. He's a opponent of recidivism and has tried to be criminal justice focused in this one area before. He supports groups like Men of Valor. So he was kind of keeping with his own agenda on criminal justice, I think, by vetoing this one.
Okay. And another bill that passed is actually set to hold private prisons accountable. It states that if the death rate gets too high, the prison will have their population reduced. What prompted this bill?
So this bill is a reaction from two Lebanon lawmakers to the increasing and kind of alarming rate of death and other violence at Trousdale Turner, which is a core civic prison. There's a man, Tim Leeper, who lives in Lebanon, who was a friend of Senator Mark Pody and Representative Clark Boyd. So they brought a pair of bills that were caption bills originally, and they debated even reducing Trousdale Turner down to minimum security. But by the time that this bill was amended, what it says is that if you are more than double the death rate of a comparable prison in Tennessee, you have to reduce your population by 10%.
And how does that hold them accountable?
I think the idea is that if there are fewer inmates, it's easier to keep them safe, especially because we've heard staffing as a reason for some of these issues at Trousdale Turner and other prisons in the past. I also have to point out that a private prison, Core Civic is a company. If you say you're going to have 10% fewer people, that's going to hit your bottom line.
Okay. Another bill on its way to the governor's desk is the Foster Care Bill of Rights. Right now, there are between 8,000 and 9,000 minors in foster care in the state. And the Tennessee Department of Children's Services has been under scrutiny for a long time, decades. Most recently, when it was revealed in 2022 that hundreds of kids were spending nights in state office buildings because of the difficulty in finding them beds. Marianna, is this a bill that is in response to that?
Not in a direct response to that specific incident. This was a bill that was actually drafted by a former foster care kid very soon before she aged out of foster care, it was part of like a senior government class that she wrote this bill for. And she found some lawmakers who were friendly to it. It's more about, through talking with her, it's more about her own experience, which did include, in some cases, sleeping in office space, but also being in certain homes where she was not aware of her rights. And so the bill is more specifically targeted at making sure that enshrining some of those rights, and making sure that foster care kids have to be alerted to those rights with a lawyer present.
So there were a lot of protesters protesting different issues at the Capitol this year. And Marianna, you spoke to some clergy members who were there protesting as well as sitting in on committee hearings. What were their main concerns?
I think a lot of those protests were targeted specifically at the education immigration bill, which would have allowed schools to deny students without legal status in education. There were also there's also a bill that would a bill that passed that would make it, nonprofits and churches legally responsible if somebody that they have housed or helped goes on to commit a crime. A lot of pushback for that. But I think overall there are a lot of clergy members who are here in Nashville who are always very active in state politics. And I think that this legislative session was no exception.
Well, Sarah Grace, thank you both. Sarah Grace will be staying with us for the remainder of the show. Marianna, thank you so much. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here. Marianna Bacallao is power and equity reporter for WPLN, Nashville Public Radio. When we come back, we will continue our review of the first half of the 114th Tennessee General Assembly. Stay with us.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Burr & Foreman Law Firm, serving clients with transactional, litigation, and regulatory needs. Discovering how each client defines a win and working with them every step of the way to achieve it. Burr.com.
I'm Mary Mancini, and this is Nashville. Today, we're recapping the Tennessee State Legislative Session, which wrapped up at the end of April. Joining us in the studio to continue the conversation are Sarah Grace Taylor, the reporter covering state government for the Nashville Banner, and WPLN morning host Nina Cardona. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi. Nina, you are also the host of the daily NashVillager podcast, where you not only relay the day's local news and analysis, but you also add historical context.
Right.
This year, 3 constitutional amendments passed their final votes in the legislature and will now be added to the ballot in 2026. Can you please explain the intricacies of Tennessee's constitutional amendment process? Could you do it in the next couple of minutes?
Well, if you want the long form version, I did do an episode on that a while back. But here's the thing to keep in mind. It is complicated. It's easier to follow if you keep in mind that basically the system is built to have a process that continues to ask us, do you really want to do that? Before it happens, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just multiple stages of that. So basically, it starts like any normal bill. It's introduced in either the House or the Senate. Both of them need to pass it by a simple majority on 3 readings. That's step 1, straightforward. Then it gets put on a shelf until there's an election, so there's a chance for people to change who's in the legislature. Then both the House and the Senate need to vote on it again, 3 times again, but this time 2/3 majority. If it passes all of that, then it goes to the voters in a referendum election on the same ballot with a governor's race. Okay. So that's what all the things that, and then that's it. That's it. If it passes the referendum, then it's a constitutional amendment.
Okay, so, and that's just a simple majority of the people's votes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sarah Grace, there are 3 That's a tough one. Constitutional amendments that have gone through that entire process and will now be put on the ballot in the next gubernatorial election in 2026. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah. So the first one says that Tennessee will never have a statewide property tax. There is not currently one. This just prohibits them from doing it in the future. The second one enacts a bill that's often called Marcy's Law that's in about a dozen other states. It creates some victims' rights in court cases, like the right to be there if you're the person you've accused of a crime is going to have a hearing. And then perhaps the more controversial one is a bill that would limit and add to the list the number of offenses for which someone can be denied bail, which obviously has raised concern with some people who are criminal justice advocates and are concerned with someone sitting in jail for a long time before they're even convicted of a crime.
Okay, so let's go back to the state, not income tax, property tax. We've already done the state income tax. The property, was there any interest in passing a state property tax? Anybody even talking about it? Or is this just something they wanted to pass just preemptively?
I think it's preemptive. As you hinted at there, they've done this before with saying we won't have a state income tax, which Tennessee doesn't have. And at the time when that happened, there was an effort to pass one. I do think it looks good for Republicans to say, hey, I prevented tax from happening, even if it wasn't happening. So I think that's more or less the impotence of this particular one. And notably, your county property tax is not going to go away. So you're still going to have property tax. They just won't add a statewide one.
Gotcha. Okay. Nina, this session also a bill establishing a public registry of domestic violence offenders was passed this year. What can you tell us about that?
Right. So it basically creates this database that anybody can access that will show repeat offenders with domestic violence convictions. So it's not retroactive, but basically from this point on, whenever anybody gets a second or third or fourth or however, second or more offense of domestic violence that they are convicted of, then they go on this registry that anybody can look up and see. Kind of like the sex offender registry, but this time for domestic violence.
And so, as you mentioned, someone would only end up if they were convicted of a second offense.
Correct.
Or more. Also, in Tennessee, people convicted of domestic violence charges are not allowed to have a gun. So
right, and that's actually a federal law.
Right.
Domestic violence precludes you from being able to legally own a firearm.
And could the registry also be used to enforce this in a way?
Not to enforce it, but it does create kind of a tool if people want to use it. I mean, the whole thing about this registry is, it's only as valuable as if people actually choose to look at it. But one of the interesting things is because by default, everybody who's on this list cannot legally own a firearm. And you've got this weird situation with private gun sales where the seller in Tennessee, if you're selling a gun privately, you're not a licensed firearms dealer, you're not required to do a background check. But there are circumstances where the seller can be held liable if the gun is sold to somebody who shouldn't have it. And so it's this weird situation, and a full background check like a firearms dealer does is expensive, and it's kind of complicated if you're not already in that system and working with it all the time. This is one way that you can check. One of the really common ways that people have that are disallowed or have to dispossess of their guns. You can check and see if somebody's on that list, you definitely shouldn't sell it to them. So there's at least one thing that you can check off the list easily, free, through this publicly accessible database.
Thank you. Okay, got it. So, Sarah Grace, were any bills that addressed gun safety introduced or passed this year?
Yeah, there were, as there tend to be, several Democratic attempts to look at gun safety. A couple somewhat related to what we were just talking about with preventing people who are known to be dangerous or presumed to be dangerous from having firearms. There was a little bit of a mismatch of a pair of Democrat bills. There's one by Shondell Brooks, the new representative in Nashville, who, in honor of her son that was killed in the Waffle House shooting, introduced a bill that mirrored a Illinois bill that said, she said it was to keep people who should not have had their guns from owning them and doing something like that again. But in its actual verbiage, it says that someone who has sought or received mental health care, been admitted for mental health care in the last 5 years, you could be liable if you were to sell them a firearm, or to transfer them in any way a firearm. So that includes like gifting someone a gun. The problem with that is that it drew scrutiny from people who are mental health advocates who said, wait, this is too broad. This could be routine mental health care like therapy, the way that it's written. So there was some argument of who all would be encompassed in that bill, even though she gave a compelling enough argument to make it through subcommittee, which is somewhat rare for a Democratic gun bill. And at the same time, you had a bill that was introduced before Brooks was even in the legislature officially, by Senator Heidi Campbell. And this bill maybe got a more narrow version of that and said that you're liable if you would transfer a gun to someone who is known or is reasonably should be known to not be allowed to possess one for any state or federal reason, which also would have encapsulated the case with the Waffle House shooting.
In Nina, in rural Scott County, the court system requires a person ordered to give up their guns to identify who they're giving them to. There's currently no state law that requires the same, but advocates, getting back to domestic violence, advocates say that puts domestic violence victims in particular at risk. A bill that was inspired by WPLN and ProPublica's reporting prompted Republican Representative Kelly Kiesling from Byrdstown to introduce a bill to change that law. What happened?
Well, it got pushed to next year. And it's an amazing thing when you look actually at Scott County and it's a super simple change they made. It's a simple form. Just making somebody fill out a form makes them take it seriously, it seems. And it's made a dramatic difference in Scott County. And so this Republican senator who brought a bill, and the fact that it was a Republican bringing it, that it's something that was a model from a rural, bright red county here in Tennessee, kind of a homegrown measure, it seemed like that if anything's going to pass, this is going to be it. And this weird act of timing, just kind of crazy. Kiesling needed to have a heart procedure done at the same time that this was coming up in the Senate Judiciary Committee. He knew that was going to happen, right? He asked one of his colleagues to be the one to present the bill on his behalf. Well, that colleague realized that the NRA doesn't like the bill. And that colleague, instead of saying, yes, I'd like us to vote on this bill today, said, I'd like to push it off till next year.
Oh.
And so Kiesling says he's going to continue to have conversations with people that it's not technically dead yet. It could come back up. And because he's a Republican, it's got a better chance than these Democrat Party sponsored bills do. But who knows? Who knows where that's going to stand next year?
Yeah. He seemed, when he was talking about it to the press, he seemed very shocked that this happened.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI, is certainly a high-profile national issue. In his first 100 days, President Trump issued executive orders to eliminate diversity initiatives within the federal government and the military. His administration has also pressured universities and major corporations with monetary consequences if they fail to roll back their initiatives. Sarah Grace, there were two bills seeking to, quote, dismantle DEI, unquote, in state government, local governments, and publicly funded colleges and universities. What do they do specifically, and did they pass?
Yeah. So the practical implication of the bills is that these groups you talked about, local government, state government, and the universities that are funded by the state, can't make hiring decisions based off of DEI practices. So while a lot of these places have had policies for a long time that say we're going to go out of our way to make sure we're inclusive in our hiring, now if you're found to have done that, you're in trouble with the state. There's another bill that's not explicitly dismantling DEI, but I do think is related to inclusion, which is the bill to dissolve the Human Rights Commission, which also passed. In doing that, the state is getting rid of its own third-party Human Rights Commission that's been around for decades to investigate claims of discrimination from employers and from landlords in kind of a non-litigious way. And now that appointed board will entirely go away, and it's roughly, I think, 32-person staff will be absorbed by the Attorney General's office, other than 2 people who will go to HR to keep doing Title VI complaints for the feds. So what that means is this protection that was there for those who felt that they were excluded is also going away as people are being discouraged to go out of their way to include people in the first place.
Yeah. Can you tell us what Title VI complaints are? Exactly?
These are civil rights discrimination complaints. So that would be if you feel you were discriminated against by sex, race, disability. A lot of, I think, the complaints in Tennessee come down to disability complaints.
And that's from the federal government. That's why they're kept, right? Because the federal government is initiating that.
Yeah. So Title VI is a federal rule that every government at every level is forced to be compliant with. So there are, I think, 2 staff positions currently in the HRC that are tied to that, and those will still exist with that job, but they'll be under the HR department.
And getting back to the first one, you mentioned that that universities and higher ed institutions won't be allowed to base their hiring practices on any DEI initiatives, or I'm assuming policies that are written. Is there anything in the bill that suggests that they have to make a report? Or I guess what I'm getting at is how will it be known if they do that? Does that just mean that they take their the policies down, that they don't actually have an official policy?
Yeah, I think it's mostly going to come down to, like we've already seen since the federal stuff that you mentioned, schools are going to remove their policies. They might, if your job title has DEI in it, I'm not sure that you'll have a job next year. And again, these are just publicly funded schools that are affected by the state bill. But I assume that if there's ever any response from the state related to this, it's going to come because of a complaint. So if someone who doesn't get a job says that someone else got a job for DEI reasons, then we'll see how the state responds to that.
Okay. Well, we also had a bill that WPLN reporter Caroline Eggers has been reporting on for a couple of years that passed this legislative session. It was to cut regulations on wetlands protections. Caroline had been reporting on this issue, like I said, for 2 years, and there has been an update. Let's take a listen.
Developers will be able to build faster and cheaper, and builders will no longer be financially incentivized to construct around wetlands. Grace Stranch, director of the Harpeth Conservancy, says our existing protections help developers to pause and perhaps consider what it means to lose a limited natural resource, because they'd either avoid wetlands or pay to replace the lost functions and value.
And so it didn't mean that they wouldn't develop, but it means that they had that intention and they had to really think about it. And now that intention is gone in so many ways, which is really heartbreaking.
It's kind of like trees. If there are strong regulations, developers usually build around trees. But it's cheaper and technically easier just to clear nature out of the way. With wetlands, developers will be able to cover the spongy, water-holding soil with concrete without much thought. So now, Governor Bill Lee will make the final call. Will he maintain our long-standing protections of wetlands, or let developers control the decision?
Nina, you've been following through your work as a morning host on WPLN and also as the host of the NashVillager podcast, Caroline's work and coverage of this issue. Yeah, so how long? It's been 2 years, correct?
Yeah, Caroline has been on this story very consistently for about 2 years now. And she's brought out a lot of not just kind of the workings in the legislature of how this has kind of been a twisty-turny path, especially in a year where our governor had stated that he wanted to protect one of our most important waterways to not be protecting wetlands. It's an interesting contrast. But Caroline's reporting has also done a lot to really explain the importance of wetlands. I mean, these are kind of our state's natural filtration system in a lot of ways. They capture a lot of stuff to keep it out of other places where it could do us some more harm, but also it's flood mitigation. It's a natural flood mitigation system. And when we're paving over our wetlands or filling them up with soil, we are increasing the chance of people's homes floodings in the areas where those wetlands had been previously nearby.
And as far as we know, as of right now, the governor has not signed that bill, even though it is on his desk.
That's my understanding.
Yeah. Nina Cardona is WPLN Nashville Public Radio's morning host and the host of the NashVillager podcast. As always, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Sarah Grace Taylor of the Nashville Banner is going to stay with us once again. And when we come back, we will continue our overview of the first half of the 114th Tennessee General Assembly. Stay with us. I'm Mary Mancini, and this is Nashville. Today, we are recapping the Tennessee State Legislative Session, which wrapped up at the end of April. Joining us to continue the conversation are Sarah Grace Taylor, reporter covering state government for the Nashville Banner, and WPLN's health reporter, Catherine Sweeney. Welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. You?
Great.
Good.
Happy to be back.
Yes, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. We are going to get to the topic at hand and talk about the state a lot more. But Catherine, in a related story, you have been reporting on how Tennessee has suddenly lost hundreds of millions of dollars as the federal government cancels promised funding. What did Governor Lee say about these funding losses?
Yeah, so in a press availability, he was answering questions from people like me in a little gaggle. And I asked, what is this doing for the state and what are the ramifications? And he was saying something that was really similar to a lot of the state agencies' responses so far, which has basically just been, it's all good over here. He said the federal government is really big and a lot of people think it needs to be cut. And so that's great. We're going to help the federal government cut its budget. We'll be partners in that. And it's basically not going to affect services.
Do we know what departments are actually being affected?
Well, I do know the Department of Health is being affected. Again, I'm the health reporter, so of course that's the one I'm most focused on. I know that the Department of Education has also seen some federal grant cuts. So is the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services.
And how do you know that the Department of Health is being affected? What are the outward signs?
Yeah, so that's kind of a weird one. DOGE, the team that Elon Musk is leading in Washington to cancel random funding mechanisms that Congress has legally authorized. They have this website that's not really searchable, but they have posts about what they've canceled. And so I was looking at that and saw Tennessee Department of Health, $100 million have been canceled. And I, sent some emails and said, what is this? Where's that coming from? And I still have never gotten any answers. I've contacted the department multiple times. I asked Governor Lee at that press availability. We still don't know. The only indication we have is that Metro lost the same kind of funding. And they're being very transparent about what it's done to them because they're actually suing about it. They're suing the federal government saying, we want that money back. Here's what we've lost. So they've talked about a pathology lab having to basically shut down and people getting laid off and it canceling measles vaccine clinics. And obviously Metro is a bit smaller than the whole state of Tennessee. So you could only imagine, what kind of impact that's having. But again, we still don't know.
So two very, very different responses from the state and Metro.
Yeah, I did a story about this last week and kind of compared and contrasted the responses because Governor Lee said, we'll be a partner. And Mayor Freddie O'Connell said, we'll see you in court. So pretty stark.
Yeah. Well, Sarah Grace, a bill setting deadlines on the clearing of homeless encampments and disposal of personal belongings passed both chambers and is awaiting the governor's signature. What are the provisions of this bill specifically?
Yeah, so this is a bill by Memphis Senator Brent Taylor, who's a Republican, who said that he had tried to call about an encampment that was somewhere in Memphis on public roads, and it was one of the most difficult things he's ever done in his life, is what he described. So this bill requires TDOT, or the Tennessee Department of Transportation, to make agreements with local governments and with the partnering agencies like nonprofits that tend to help find housing for the unhoused. And it requires that they have an agreement of what we're going to do with people if they are under a bridge or if they are on something that is TDOT's property. And it sets, I think, a 30-day limit on how quickly these agencies have to respond when there's a request like this. And it requires that they give a 10-day notice to the residents of these encampments before they do a clearing. There's a lot of back and forth of what that's going to mean for people's personal property. And at one point, I think the bill had attempted to create a storage solution so that people had a certain amount of time to go get their personal effects after the clearing, which still had its own set of problems. But even that was removed from the bill because of the fiscal note associated with doing that.
So what's going to happen to the personal belongings now, according to that bill?
I think the idea is that these agreements will be different by each city, so the specifics will be different. But the sponsor's intent, he says, is that local governments and these nonprofits will have a plan so that when you hear this notice and you have this much time to respond, they will help people get their personal effects and get into housing. Of course, the problem with that is it doesn't create any more housing or any permanent place for these people to go. So the bottleneck that already exists that in many cases has caused these people to be unhoused isn't necessarily being solved. And there's a lot of concern that people will end up still unhoused and maybe missing personal belongings, including documents that can help you become housed if this happens too rapidly.
And so service providers who help people experiencing homelessness have those concerns. Do they have any others?
No, those are the crux of their concerns, and they tried even to get the bill amended to give them extra time, and the outcome of the bill was what they're most concerned about, and that's that they're going to have these short turnarounds to get people prepared to be cleared out of their encampments.
And just clarify one other thing for me. This applies just to state-owned lands.
I think that's right. It's stuff that's right-of-way, so it's things that look like they're on the street, right? So if you're on a state road and there's a bridge and an overpass and someone's made an encampment there, that would apply. But this doesn't necessarily do anything for like private property. If you see an encampment on like a vacant lot, that's not going to be affected by this.
Okay. Well, so we talked about the process for bills when they get to the governor's desk. He has these three choices. Either he can sign it into law, he can leave it unsigned and it becomes law, or he can veto it. While some bills are actually waiting on his desk, Governor Lee has already signed the Fertility Treatment and Contraceptive Protection Act into law. And that law protects in vitro fertilization and birth control. And it says in part that, quote, the laws of this state clearly and unambiguously acknowledge the right of an individual to perform and the right of an individual to receive or use fertility treatment and contraceptives in the state, end quote. Catherine, did these legal protections already exist?
Yeah, they did. So there's been a lot with health this year, especially reproductive health, that is just bills saying we're just clarifying existing law. They don't necessarily change policies or make things legal that weren't legal or make things illegal that were legal. They just say, just so we're all on the same page, you're allowed to have birth control and you're allowed to do IVF.
And this bill was bipartisan.
Right.
And the governor signed it despite objections from some in his own party.
Yeah.
A lot in his own party, actually.
Yeah. So two things about this bill that I think are interesting. One, it was pitched last year and failed. And it was pretty much the same thing, but I think the vibes were very different. So around that time, the Alabama Supreme Court had just made a decision on interpreting the Death of a Minor Act in that state. And they said that embryos have the same rights as any child. And so all these people were like, oh, God, does that mean embryos at IVF clinics are all legally people, which means we can't discard them because that's murder? And what does this mean and that mean? And so Democrats across the country in Congress and in state houses pitched bills like this one saying, will you clarify that IVF is legal and not murder here? And so when it was just seen as this like nationwide Democratic blowback, this was written off as, oh, they're scaremongering. They're trying to paint us as people who are taking people's rights away. This is all fake. And so we don't need this bill. It doesn't do anything. This is already legal here. And so this year, the same proposal comes up, but the vibes are different. And so it's just received very differently. It wasn't this like fight the way that it was before. But there was still some opposition, like as you said. So, that's a little bit complicated. I think people are not necessarily coming out and saying that they are opposed to contraceptive access. That's not something we're seeing. But we are seeing reproductive rights advocates saying that's coming down the pike. That's the next battle after all of these abortion issues is contraceptive access. And then similarly, there are a lot of Republicans who say that's fear-mongering. But WPLN, not me, some of our other reporters and ProPublica did this long story about reproductive health in Tennessee. And there were, right to life anti-abortion activists recorded on the phone with multiple state lawmakers here saying, we do want to crack down on Plan B next, which is a contraceptive. And this kind of gets in the weeds, but basically the way Plan B works is it makes the walls of the uterus kind of harden up and make it hard for an embryo to stick to it. So in nature, without any kind of intervention, about 50% of embryos fail to attach anyway. And so Plan B just kind of keeps that from happening.
But it is classified as contraceptive.
Right. It prevents a
contraception
pregnancy
right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's totally legal right now, but it is a controversial medication, despite the fact that it does just prevent pregnancy. There are people who argue that it's an abortifacient, which is not accurate. So that is kind of seen as like this future battle. And we're already seeing indications of it again, in private recordings and stuff like that. And all of that to say, that was a big tangent, but that is, there's concern that the reason people don't want bills like this is because it makes the whole Plan B fight harder down the road. If we are already saying, hey, that's legal here, we have a bill saying, hey, that's legal here, it could make it more difficult to crack down on that medication.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. That was very thorough. Appreciate that. Yeah. And totally changing topics. Okay. Legislators this year passed a bill requiring schools to create cell phone ban policies, which I imagine the kids don't like at all. But what was the justification behind introducing this legislation?
Yeah, so this has been done at other places too, but the idea that sponsors say is that having phones or other personal devices in class not only distract from instruction and therefore make kids pay less attention, but also can contribute to things like cyberbullying, because when you have all those kids together at a certain age and they're able to access the internet, it's easier to do that from school grounds. So what the policy does that passed is requires each individual school district to come up with a policy that bans personal laptops, video games, any other wireless device like that, including phones. But it leaves a lot of that customizable by the local school board. So what their safety plan is going to be, which they're required to come up with, is different. Whether kids have to fully leave devices at home or in their car, or if they're allowed to bring them and leave them in a backpack, can vary. And then whether these are banned only during classroom time or the whole time they're at school. So like lunch and everything else will depend based on the school board. So these school boards have to come up with a plan pretty quickly this summer before the next school year.
Well, to stay on the topic of teens, and we only have a minute or two left, but Catherine, you reported that Tennessee's teenage vaping rate is double the country's. And there's been some bills addressing that this year?
Yeah, I'll try to get through this quick. There's kind of a big vaping bill, and it did a lot of different things. One, it said you have to ID everyone, even if they look young. It used to be if they looked under 30. And then they're trying to make sure, this is a big part of it, that vape stores have a log that they file to the state saying every product that they sell, because there's this huge issue with fake and counterfeit vapes coming in from China, which is crazy. I guess even just legal vapes, back in 2020, there were about 400 different products available, according to the FDA. Now it's almost 6,000 different products. It's just exploded. And then Well, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Can you wrap it up real quick?
Yeah. They're just trying to say we're reining that in. There are too many vapes available to kids, and they're obviously using them.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to Sarah Grace Taylor of the Nashville Banner and Marianna Bacallao, Nina Cardona, and Catherine Sweeney of WPLN for joining us today. Tune in tomorrow for part 2 of our review of the state legislative session. We're going to dig a bit deeper. We're going to talk about some analysis and how will the legislation passed on issues like education, immigration, and foster care impact the lives of the people who live and work in Tennessee. Plus, tomorrow we're also opening up the phone lines. And if you'd like to catch up on any This Is Nashville episodes you missed, like this week's one-on-one interview with Amy Grant or the latest episode of In My Place, our series about what communities can do to prevent and end homelessness, check out our podcast. You'll find almost every This Is Nashville episode right there. Thank you for tuning in this hour. This Is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced by me. It was directed by Tasha A.F. Lemley. Board operator is Liv Lombardi. The masterminds behind our music are Larange and Namir Blade. Special thanks to Tony Gonzalez. And the conversation doesn't end here. You can comment and tell us what you want to hear on the show by leaving us a message at 615-751-2500. This is Nashville. I'm Mary Mancini, and we'll see you tomorrow, everybody.